The wilderness isn't always neutral. People like to imagine it as indifferent, but sometimes it keeps quiet, so others can hide in it. Out there, loneliness felt like safety at first, until I realized it meant no one could help if something happened. That's when instincts matter more than explanations. Your brain won't always sound reasonable, but fear is its own kind of alarm. Ignoring it to look brave doesn't guarantee survival. Choosing safety can leave guilt, but moving toward danger can leave nothing at all. Sometimes the only proof you made the right choice is still breathing. One headline can rewrite every memory. I was sitting on my couch years after that Christmas, half scrolling without much attention, clicking through articles the way people do late at night when they're awake for no good reason. My stomach dropped when I saw the name of the forest. Not just the state or region, but the exact forest where I'd set up that camp, the same one where I'd heard the scream. It looked harmless in bold text, just another news piece, until the words underneath spelled out what I didn't want to imagine. Pellis had uncovered a biker gang, running operations inside that forest during the same span of years when I'd gone there at first. I thought maybe it was being exaggerated. News sometimes phrases things just to catch eyes, but the further I read, the less room I had to pretend. According to the article, that gang hadn't just been riding through for fun or pushing drugs like I might have expected. The reports lined them up with abductions, torture, and disappearances, tied neatly to holidays when families assumed people were off visiting or celebrating. It was Christmases, Thanksgivings, New Year's nights, when thin excuses covered empty chairs at tables. The timeline was chilling in how specific it ran. The article included a detailed section, mapping their activity year by year, and there it was, a spike, not just in summer, when camping is popular, but right at the holiday season. Law enforcement placed incidents near trailheads and among backcountry sites. Reading that, the pages on my laptop blurred, because the graph pointed directly on top of the week I had been there. Same space, same season. I leaned back against my chair, pushed my palms into my face, and repeated, "No way," like saying it out loud might bend the reality of it, and then I kept reading. Victims weren't listed by name in the main piece, but descriptions slipped out. Travelers alone, drifters, people that wouldn't be missed until later. Someone had screamed for help once, heard hours apart by a passing hiker who thought it was too risky to investigate. Another story mentioned gunfire splitting the air in irregular bursts, close enough to make campers abandon their sites at night and walk out. My throat locked up as I scrolled, because every detail fell against my memories in perfect rhythm. Gunshots out of sync, frantic instead of controlled. A scream on December nights, with no answer following. The way silence sat too heavy after, like the woods felt staged. It mirrored too close to brush off. I froze in my chair, alternating between reading more and staring straight ahead at the wall. It was like the article wasn't giving me new information. It was finishing the sentences of my own memories. It confirmed the things I'd told myself were tricks of the mind. Survivor testimony appeared a few paragraphs later. A man described how he'd been tied up under tarps, hidden near the bank of the same river trail I had followed in. He said he could hear his own screams carried down trees, twisting loud, then vanishing sharp, never answered. He wasn't saved. That night, he only got out after slipping one knot and running half-naked through waist-deep drifts. As soon as I read it, I felt like the ground tilted. My chest pressed against itself, so heavy I was certain I might faint where I sat, because that was the exact signature of the scream I'd tried to bury. Short, uneven, high, then cut. It was too precise to be anything else. That was when the fear twisted into a different weight. Terror never left, but layered over it came a grim relief that I hadn't moved toward it. For years I'd been angry at myself for sticking near the fire. I'd thought I'd chosen cowardice over responsibility. But reading that testimony, knowing the gang had used holiday nights as cover to cage strangers, I realized what chasing that scream might have meant. I wouldn't be here to rethink it. I wouldn't be anywhere. My bones would be out there buried among bare trees under frost, chalked up as another hiker lost to winter. That kind of relief feels sick, because it isn't happiness. It's relief, heavy with someone else's pain. Through the comment section below, others admitted they had ignored screams too. Some hikers explained how they reported odd noises, but left quickly without following up. One wrote about seeing distant firelight that didn't feel natural and rushing away from it. It wasn't just me. People collectively avoided, turned blind, because their instincts carried warning deeper than they could rationalize. Knowing that didn't erase guilt, but it mixed it. It shifted my guilt from being a selfish coward into being part of a larger truth. The bait had been too sharp and too deliberate. Reading those stories clarified what I had wondered for years. The scream wasn't a figment. The gunfire wasn't some reckless holiday hunt. My nerves that night hadn't been fabrications. They had been proof my body sensed patterns I couldn't untangle at the time. It drew strange validation, even as my insides writhed at the cost, because the doubts I'd carried all those years, the voice in my head saying, "You exaggerated. You let fear cloud it." That voice fell silent. I knew now. The fear had been real. The sounds had been real. Something had stalked those trees, with more purpose than ghosts of my imagination. The reflection that spun out from there turned darker than before. I thought again about each detail from that night. The way footsteps lined with mine. The way I swore I saw eyes flick in the branches. How the echo of shots carried so long I couldn't judge the source. I replayed it all against the police timeline and realized they weren't the coincidences. I had been closer than I let myself admit. I'd stood one bad choice away from capture. That made my skin prickle worse in hindsight than it had in the actual moment. Because hindsight cuts away denial. I couldn't save myself with maybe anymore. The article erased every maybe. I wish I could say the news lifted the weight off my chest. But the truth is it did the opposite. It steadied certain fears while planting others deeper. Because now, whenever silence presses too long, I think about how thin the line was between me and the ones who didn't walk out. Surviving felt less like triumph and more like a lottery I won without earning. My choice to stay put, instead of following the noise, had been survival cloaked in cowardice. It kept me alive, but it confirmed pain for someone else. That's a truth that splits you. Gratitude and shame bound together. I sat with that article for hours, reading it again and again, until the text burned into me. The couch felt smaller beneath me. The room looked warped at its edges. Holiday. Lights flickered from across the street in my neighbor's window, and even they looked sinister for a moment, like small false beacons set to lure travelers close. That night I barely moved, alternating between shaking, clutching my stomach, and pressing two fingers to my temple, repeating lines too simple. It was real. You got out. Others didn't. Those words helped me, even though they also widened guilt. The news gave me something final, in a way though. It untangled the question I had wrestled with for years. Was it my paranoia, or was it the dark? The answer was both. It was paranoia shaped by real predators. I wasn't imagining watchers in the woods. I wasn't inventing sounds. I was experiencing danger without a name. And the name arrived years later in black print, across a headline, waiting to tell me that silence and fear had protected me, even as it swallowed someone else whole. That's the piece I can't shake. The scream didn't vanish into nothing. It docked itself into someone's history, into bruises and rope burns and scars. My ears hadn't lied. My instincts hadn't lied. When I stare into darkness now, it isn't ghosts I see. It's human faces stolen into shadows by hands who knew the forest too well, and no matter how long ago it was, that holiday night lives as a reminder that survival doesn't always clean. Sometimes it attaches itself like a scar you carry, proof that night was an escape rather than an ending. And every holiday since, no matter how warm and crowded the rooms might be, I know where my mind travels. Right back to that forest. Right back to the sound of a stranger's scream bouncing off snow-drowned trees, unanswered forever. Home doesn't quiet your mind when you left screams behind. I thought once I stepped off that trail and into the glow of headlights, I'd breathe differently, feel free again, like the air was safer. For a few hours, maybe even a couple days. That actually worked. I told myself I'd just had a long night, that nothing followed me out of the trees, that people hearing echoes or mistaking animal cries for more sinister things wasn't unusual. But the quiet at home wasn't really quiet anymore. It replayed pieces from that night in smaller ways, little reminders hiding in the background. It wasn't the memory of the cold or the snow clumped on branches, it was the sound of a scream, carried wrong through the air, and the sharp pop of gunfire that wound itself into every silence I tried to rest in. At first, I'd find myself sitting on my bed, staring at the wall without meaning to, listening for some distortion that wasn't there. I'd catch myself holding my breath, as though sound would cut through at any second. The relief of reaching home dwindled fast. My house felt warm enough, the walls solid enough, but as soon as I closed the door, I kept glancing back at it, almost expecting cold air to leak in. The woods had trained me that something pressing against you can't always be seen, and that idea transported itself into every corner. The furnace clicking on late at night made my stomach tighten. Floorboards groaning under their own weight kept me awake because they lined up too easily with phantom footsteps I thought I'd heard. In snow, the replay was worse than the actual experience. Most of the forest sounds blurred in memory, but two things didn't: the scream and the trailing sense of being observed. Each time work or errands dulled me enough to forget, it came back in still environments. Washing dishes at the sink, I'd catch my reflection in the kitchen window faint behind the outside dark, and for a second be sure I saw something move next to it. Brushing my teeth with the fan buzzing overhead, I felt certain someone stood in the hallway, just out of sight. My brain used missing space to fill. Every shadow at the corner of my vision rearranged into imagined eyes. It infected my routine quietly. I stopped leaving the blinds open after 9. I locked both the top and bottom bolt every night, and checked them again before lying down. I dug a flashlight from the garage I'd barely used in years, and started carrying it whenever I took the trash out, even in plain lit evenings. Walking across the backyard, I caught myself turning fast, waiting for crunching steps in grass that never came. The woods had carved something into me, and part of me knew it wouldn't go away easy. Avoidance grew fast. Friends asked if I wanted to hike with them, and I made excuses. Even simple suggestions like walking around the lake path in town turned my chest sour. I'd smile, say I was busy, stay behind, and flip it casual. The truth was, I hated the idea of being surrounded by trees again. I swapped old hobbies without admitting it. My camping gear stayed shoved into a tote at the back of my closet, unwashed and crammed. Even looking at it folded in wrong angles made my shoulders tense up. I never told anyone why I suddenly stopped. Explaining it out loud meant repeating memories I didn't want to acknowledge. The guilt was sourer than fear. Every quiet hour at the house left me circling the same thought. What if that scream had been real? A person pulled into something, and my only contribution had been to turn away. The temptation to rationalize never really worked. Sure, it could have been bait. Sure, it could have been an animal noise mistaken for human, but my body cataloged it differently. Every nerve that rang that night remembered it, and nerves know more than rational thought sometimes. Having saved myself by ignoring another meant survival mixed with shame. I'd sit at my dining table with a mug in hand, staring down steam, pretending to enjoy calm, then picture a figure out there in snow as the voice cut short. My breath would spike as if I was still by the fire with shadows circling. The conflict in my chest bent back and forth, until it rotted into the way I carried myself daily. Gratitude flickered because I lived. I went home. I returned to warmth. Then shame darkened quick, whispering how easy it had been to let silence win. To refuse stepping toward the unknown because I feared disappearing myself. Holidays hit strange after that. My parents offered food, asked why I avoided them, joked about me being a hermit. I couldn't explain why Christmas light strings across rooftops reminded me of dim headlamp beams against snow. I had no good reason to give them for preferring alone time, so I shrugged it off. Inside, I knew the trigger. My only true Christmas memory for years was that scream. The season no longer meant gatherings or gifts. It meant the sound of emptiness pressing too hard with one human note, frightening enough to undo all imagination of comfort. Years went by, but each one stapled the same quiet images to my brain. I'd be driving home from late shifts and find my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, too long, staring not at headlights, but at imagined figures just outside visibility. I'd shower late and see shapes form in the steam on the glass, convincing myself an outline shifted in condensation though. I knew it was random. My home never turned haunted. It was me that carried the haunting. If you leave something unsolved, it follows in patterns you don't choose. The oddest part was how places I once trusted became loaded. A walk down a grocery aisle where no one stood felt like pacing a trail with someone behind me again. A stranger brushing near made my shoulders crawl like a branch cracking in distance. Sleep wasn't peace either. The worst dreams replayed the same loop. I'd hear the scream again, but this time my body would move toward it, only to find darkness reaching back. I'd wake sweating, pulse sharp, blanket twisted. Sometimes I muttered no, out loud, as if refusing, even in sleep. The woods never came back as beauty. For people around me, winter forests meant cabins wrapped in lights, snow piled safe, mugs steaming by windows. For me, the trees never shed that edge. When I pictured them, it wasn't branches and white stillness that rose to mind first, it was bare trunks, leaning like figures, rings of sound bouncing wrong, and my boots pressing desperate grooves. Beauty had evaporated, and threat replaced it full. That unfair trade skewed all memory until I had nothing soft left to hold. Just raw terror burned and cold. One realization crept in over time, carried slower than guilt or shame. The mind hangs tighter to the things that terrify. It forgets the warmth of a house soaked in yellow light after snow, or the weight lifted when doors locked from inside. Those fade. What doesn't fade is fear, pressed so deep you can feel it, years later, as if it's still happening. I might not recall the exact taste of that meal I cooked with smoke clinging to me by campfire, but I can rebuild the pitch of the scream instantly inside me. I might not remember which road sign I first passed leaving the forest, but I replay the feeling of eyes unseen behind branches without effort. That's what the mind preserves, not so much what comforts, but what cuts hardest. Time blurred its way forward though, and I let the memories stay quieter, buried under work, small joys, and routine. Still, the weight hadn't left, and deep down I didn't expect it would. I told myself maybe I'd never really know, that maybe it was safer I hadn't chased answers that night. Acceptance came thinly, more like coping than healing. And then years later, breaking routine, I scrolled headlines without intention of reading deep. The name of a forest grabbed me. It was the same stretch, the same ridge and valley. Something stopped my hand and froze me stiff. Because there it was, years after, suggesting proof I'd buried as half-imagined guilt. A headline sitting bold enough to pull everything back, ready to rewrite every memory I'd tried to smother. Leaving didn't end, the fear it just changed it. Once I pulled away from camp, the idea of being circled by eyes in the dark morphed into something even less certain. The fire behind me flickered out of sight, and with it went the thin comfort of warmth and light. Ahead I faced only narrow trails buried in snow, faint ruts threaded between trees under a sky thick with clouds. There was no moon, no stars, just a pale cast across the ground where the snow caught whatever light still bled from the horizon. That glow became my sole guide, flattening the world into black outlines and white patches. Each step measured because I couldn't easily tell where the trail dipped low or where branches jutted across without warning. I learned fast that fear doesn't taper with distance, it only shifts its shape. Now, instead of bracing for something stepping into camp, I fought the steady urge to look over my shoulder. Every 10 or so paces I'd break stride, whip around, and stare hard into the spaces between trunks. Nothing stirred. Even the wind barely breathed. Yet somehow the quiet left more weight than noise could have. My boots dragged against frozen ground, kicking powder and crunching deep. Each time I stumbled into uneven level, a jolt shot through me, fear spiking, not at the fall, but at how loud it rang as I found balance again. What unnerved me most wasn't crunch or snap, but the delay of it all. I'd place one boot forward, feel pressure, wait that half second, and only then hear the snow yield under me. The sound lagged behind the action, twisting sense into something alien. When branches snapped off in the distance, the mismatch grew. Worse, I could never tell how far away it had cracked, or if it lined with my own weight. By the 4th or 5th stumble, I knew clumsiness like that could get me killed. Not necessarily because of injury, but because being vulnerable in that moment meant not seeing something else moving when it decided to. That realization left my steps sharp and deliberate, slower, but no calmer. I tried distracting myself with patterns of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, over and over, counting low in my head as if that anchor might keep the rest away. I broke it. At 50 then started again. 100 came like nothing, yet I remembered almost none of it. Later those numbers would blur, until I wasn't sure if I'd ever counted at all, or if my brain faked the memory to protect me. Even then, the only thing I wholly remember was how tight the air felt when guilt flickered again, because as steady as counting might be, the scream found its way back in between beats. It came all at once like playback, as if my body recorded the exact pitch and scraped it across my spine to remind me. Each pause between steps let the echo replay jagged and raw, and no matter how deeply I pulled against the straps of my pack, the sound carried through anyway. I bit the inside of my cheek to pull attention, sank teeth until I tasted copper. But a simple distraction couldn't mute guilt. It wasn't leaving me. At intervals, that scream painted the trees, making it impossible to say I was just unlucky, listening to strange noise. The feeling of having abandoned something, breathing and alive, cemented with every memory replay. Your brain makes certain adjustments when panic holds too long. It begins carving shapes in places where not enough information exists. That psychology dragged me downhill on that trail. Every branch I passed in my side I fattened into a figure leaning. Every split line of bark became a shoulder. Every humped mound off-trail a back curved low. I rubbed my eyes raw through my gloves, blinked, even laughed at myself out loud once, whispering idiot in a harsh breath. But the trick didn't disappear. Night uses shapes as weapons, and thinking I'd braced myself against it only made it easier to fall for. The air grew crueler as the hours drew. Wind drifted through with longer sweeps and carried sounds that blended too closely to whispers. It didn't matter that I knew air, when it moves past bare branches, can imitate voices. The sharp mutters brushed my ears, as if someone trailed me close enough to breathe suggestions down my neck. I fought the urge to answer back, telling myself loud words would do nothing but declare my spot. Snow drifted off in thin streams across my path. Each one looked like a hand, outstretched, cut short by air. The forest wasn't welcoming me out. It was dressing itself against me, piling illusions until every step felt more like trespass than retreat. Halfway out, I reached a rise where the trail lifted over a ridge. The climb forced me to stop and pant, clouding up my scarf until the fabric froze stiff against my lips. That pause broke rhythm, made the counting worthless again. Then I heard a noise, unlike wind, unlike snow or cracking. It was staggered, shifting fast, like boots scraping not quite hidden. I jerked toward it, dragging my hood back to clear my ears. Nothing moved outright, but every instinct screamed a different message. I wasn't alone in the climb, not this ridge, not this time. My reaction became split. On one hand, no steps repeated once I listened harder. On the other, my body responded as if someone had crouched, no more than a turn away, watching me hesitate at each drag of my boots. The thought swelled bigger when I added in the scream and the shots. What if I had walked right into the space of whoever caused both? That possibility clenched down every time I collected breath. I adjusted my bag straps, whispered one more count to force calm, but the ridge didn't lighten. It shadowed itself heavier, every tree now marked as a place where eyes could wait. Hours blurred. I can only recall them in pieces, the sting of nails as I pressed them through gloves into my palm to fight shaking, the burn along my calves as packed snow stiffened my joints, the quick prayer I'd aimed low into the ground, asking for nothing more than to not see movement in my periphery. By this point, exhaustion curled around me like rope. I stumbled again, and this time my knee punched into snow so deep it shocked cold all through me. Crawling free made me sick, bile edging up my throat, until I forced myself upright knowing if I lingered, collapsed. It might be the only position I'd die in. That was when the brain lured me cruelly again. Shadows moved, I swore, behind me, up on the higher ridge. I didn't check long enough to prove, only glanced. Convinced shoulders rounded and ducked out of sight before I completed turning. That was worse than outright proof, because confirmation might mean real strategy, but doubt leaves you stammering between fight or keep pacing away. I chose motion, faster, despite every muscle buckling. My steps rang louder downhill, snapping, frozen crust on each thrust. I barely cared if anything tracked the sound. The crescendo only softened when I finally carved down and saw it a faint line of brightness far ahead. The suggestion of lamps filtering through branches and broken specks. At first, I thought my mind had cracked one last time, setting hallucinations so I wouldn't collapse. Stone certainty hit only when the specks multiplied, smearing a quiet glow across deep-buried trail signs. The trailhead, safety sat no more than half a mile ahead. That glimpse almost dropped me to my knees out of raw relief. I clenched instead, pressed teeth tight, and forced rhythm back into my boots no matter their protest. I broke branches clean in my carelessness then, didn't care, and ripped into clearance faster than comfort allowed, past one bend, glow-soaked, full, spilling across the narrowed snowpath. Posts leaned crooked where signs informed hikers of distances none of us cared about in winter. My chest swelled heavy, breath biting hard inside lungs, but steadier in its rush. I knew I'd make it out. That thought offered one last flare of calm. Still, as the path pushed me toward faint silhouettes of parked cars down below, one awareness dragged with me. I hadn't shed unease by leaving. It had grafted onto me. I'd felt it tracking all those hours back to the trailhead, and I knew then, stepping weak toward shoddy safety outlines of human spaces, that fear like that doesn't vanish when you leave. The trees it takes root deep, and it waits, ready to surface again years later, even when you least want it. Sometimes survival is about leaving, not confronting. I don't think I accepted that until the moment my eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, and my own body shook so badly I couldn't pass it off as cold anymore. Sitting there in the small orange light made me feel like prey waiting on a stage. The fire, which seemed like my anchor earlier, had become the thing betraying me the loudest, announcing me to anyone who cared to look. Staying put felt like arrogance, like daring whatever circled to finally step closer. The other option, putting out the fire, or sneaking away, was heavy in my chest, but it was the only one that made sense. I had to leave. I clung to that small fact, even when guilt tried to argue back, whispering about the scream I'd already ignored, the possibility that maybe someone needed me. Self-preservation smothered that argument. The thought of packing was worse than the thought of walking blindly into more snow, because every move inside that tight ring of firelight was a fresh signal. I reached for my pack anyway, fingers stiff, and that first tug on the zipper nearly made me gag on panic. The metal teeth dragged loud enough to echo in my ears. It felt like standing in a library and slamming a door with everyone watching. I froze with my hands locked on the zipper pull, until my breathing slowed barely enough to move again. Piece by piece, I began cramming things into the bag, rolling food wrappers so they wouldn't crinkle, collapsing the stove quietly while smoke still clung to it. My hands shook the whole time, making smooth work impossible. Small clangs came. Anyway, I flinched at every one like I'd thrown rocks into an echo chamber. But I kept telling myself the choice was better than waiting until dawn and risking. Whoever had emptied that rifle earlier wandering closer. As I worked, I repeated a simple line in my head: the faster you leave, the less chance anything follows. It wasn't comforting, but at least it gave my body a task when my mind wanted to unravel. I didn't even bother with the tent stakes buried in the frozen ground. I ripped the cords free, let the stakes stay, because pulling them up meant metallic screeches. The nylon folded loud in my arms anyway, every crunch ringing like I'd fired a flare. I stuffed it into the bag clumsily, half hanging out, and told myself neatness didn't matter. All that mattered was movement, getting closer to a road. I pictured the ranger station down by the highway, a brown building I'd passed on the drive-in. The memory became a finish line I could focus on as the panic built heavier around me. Before I stood, I listened one more time. Nothing bounced back. No clear step, no voice, no snap. Still, the pressure that had grown in my stomach told me that waiting for proof was the worst mistake I could make. I swung the bag over my back, flinched at how the buckles clinked, and rested there crouched, knees bending into snow. Then I scuffed a little snow against the fire, not too much, but enough to dim it down so flames fell into orange coals. The dark rushed forward the second the light shrank, as if it had been waiting to take over again. Leaving camp wasn't the relief I thought it would be. In fact, stepping away from the dim comfort of that glow pressed a throb in my chest worse than staying. My boots sank deep. Each drag of foot left a trail more obvious than a signpost. Snow up to the shins slowed me. Every pull free was loud, a suction-ripping noise as I trudged. It sounded so exaggerated in the silence, I kept looking behind me. Sure, the prince would mark me out for anything watching. The trick of the wind made branches heavy and unload clumps from above. Each thud forced me to hunch lower and try to move faster. After only a few minutes, my lungs burned hot, even in the frozen air. Breath plumed around me like smoke signals. Each puff hovered white, reminding me of how visible, even invisible things could become in the woods. It felt as if just by breathing I was pointing myself out. My shoulders ached from the bag too, straps pressed into bone under layers of coat, and with each mile that would only worsen. Still, stopping wasn't an option. Every time my body slowed, silence pressed in stronger than anything from the trees. It was a silence not of comfort, but of pressure, as though freezing air demanded I move or be crushed under it. My head spun between labels. Either I was being cowardly or I was being smart. Coward because maybe nothing real crouched near camp and I had abandoned noise tonight for shadows in my mind. Smart because gunfire and screams on the same night didn't turn peaceful by themselves. Coward because I had ignored what might be someone's life hanging on my choice. Smart because my own life likely depended on not wandering into a noise laid exactly to pull me near. The conflict didn't ease as I walked. It built, threatening to churn heavier than my heavy legs. I kept staring ahead. Snow dimly lit by the washed-out white that hung where moonlight and cloud cover mixed. Trails carved faint lines, but the deeper I went, the more each cross-trail blurred with snow mounds. I memorized turns by gut, praying I didn't loop myself back. My boots dragged slow. Ankles burned from pulling free again and again. Arms clenched against the straps like maybe if I carried myself tight enough, I could vanish from whatever listened. Behind me, snow snapped down again with the weight of its own branches. But every time it happened, I whipped my head, thinking it was steps. Breath tore out of me, heavy and ragged. I bit my lip once, to keep from panting too loud. Taste of iron spread across my tongue. I spat into snow, and the stain gleamed darker, a reminder of how fragile my body had become in all my layers and fears. I focused instead on counting steps, whispering small numbers into my scarf, letting myself at least keep track of my own sound. Every 100 steps, I'd pause and turn, crouched low, listening hard. Nothing drifted toward me then. Nothing except the same wind sighing thick through trees. Still, in those pauses, silence didn't feel neutral. It felt like something aware, pushing pressure back into me to march faster. By the time sweat slicked my shoulders, my thighs screamed with effort. Heat trapped inside layers of clothes, rubbed raw against my collar. The balance of exhaustion with fear grew sharper, but I never let myself stop longer than half a minute. I refused to risk letting the weariness push me to sit, because sitting meant the possibility of closing my eyes even briefly. If I slept out there, if I lost track of time even slightly, the chance was too high that whatever circled would finish closing the distance. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was instinct living active across my chest. I kept moving into dark, not because I wanted to stay alive in any bold, defiant sense, but because something heavier swirled inside me. I realized survival wasn't hopeful, it was a refusal. Each drag of boot wasn't an action toward safety, but the only protest I had against what pressed against me. I chose to enter deeper darkness instead of welcoming whatever could have revealed itself back at camp. If answers waited in that clearing, I would never feel them explained. I left that incomplete, unsolved, because the cost of trying to understand was too high. Once I admitted that to myself, something broke and steadied inside me at the same time. The woods didn't forgive my steps or make them easier, but they at least pushed forward without denying me. Each snow crunch sharpened louder, but made more sense. The rhythm built like proof that saying nothing, investigating nothing, was the only path. That evening would remain unanswered. I carried it into the trees like a secret. But even as the distance grew, even while exhaustion turned shaking into steadier rhythm, fear didn't die there. It followed with each drag, each shallow breath, stamped into the ice like second footprints alongside mine. And I knew, no matter how far I walked, it was no longer something I could leave behind. A sound no one ever wants to hear carried on that icy wind scream. It wasn't a long drawn-out one like in movies, but sharp, rising too high before cutting off as if something slammed it flat. The trees swallowed it in pieces, pushing it forward then, dragging it back, so I had the strangest sense it was both ahead of me and at my side. For a full second, I didn't even breathe, because I needed to hear it again, to make sure I wasn't confusing it with another snap of wood or some animal cry. But even before I told myself that, I already knew what I'd heard. My body recognized the note of a human voice, before my mind accepted it. The air that night froze sound into sharper edges. When the cry cut through, it sliced the quiet in a way no branch breaking ever did. It wasn't clean though. It carried struggles, uneven wavers like the person gasped mid-yell, or wasn't getting enough air. I clutched the side of my knee without realizing, my hand digging hard into my own leg, waiting with my throat tight. A part of me wanted another round of it to confirm it was real. Another part prayed I wouldn't hear it again. That tension stretched longer when nothing followed. My campfire cracked once, and it felt out of place against the hanging absence where the voice had been. My first instinct was ugly. It wasn't heroic. I didn't stand up and charge toward the sound. I just sat still, hands trembling, repeating in my head that there was no way I'd hurt a person. Maybe an animal, maybe a fox making its high-pitched call, echo. But the truth was simple. My insides locked, because on some level they knew this wasn't an animal. Every nerve pushed the word danger louder than I wanted to hear. Then came the pause, the kind that didn't fit nature. Usually after a loud noise in the woods, birds scatter, branches flick from them flying. Small things start up again because they don't share our sense of lingering shock. But after that scream cut out, the forest went flat. No shifting branches, no sigh of wind weaving through needles, no hint of a squirrel warning its kind. I listened so hard my ears rang, but there was nothing. Just silence, whose weight felt heavier than the scream itself. The guilt started at the edges then. What if someone needed help? What if a hiker got injured, slipped down near the frozen river, broke something, and that noise I heard had been pain instead of fear? My brain threw me that scenario, because that was easier to sit with than what it really sounded like. Imagining someone twisted on a riverbank led me believe there was still a safe explanation. But every time I leaned into that, my stomach pulled, harder the other way, reminding me of the way the sound cut out stiffly, like it was swallowed by something, not trailed off naturally. I told myself options. I could head toward it, check for proof, call out. My voice might not carry far, but at least it would show whoever it was that another person had heard them. Or I could stay hidden here, crouch near the fire, and wait until dawn when moving. Felt safer. Safety or responsibility. Picking between them felt like my arms were tied to both sides. I stood halfway up. My boots crunched onto the snow, and I jolted again, head jerking back toward the line of trees at the sound of my own step. I waited to see if it triggered any response. None came. Just that plain, eerie nothing. I crouched back down almost immediately, heart hammering so hard I swallowed saliva the wrong way and started coughing quietly behind my glove. That pathetic noise felt louder than the gunshots earlier. I thought about what I knew of predators, not just animals but humans too. Anything that wanted to bring you closer would use bait. If someone wanted me to walk into the dark, they'd drag sound out just like that. A scream is the sharpest hook for human instinct, making you feel selfish if you don't walk toward it. Rational or not, I couldn't unhook that thought. My brain whispered that heading toward the noise was the one thing they'd want me to do if somebody out there was dangerous, so I stayed where I was, clutching myself against that fire glow that felt less like warmth and more like a poor excuse for protection. I hated the realization forming that I wasn't going to investigate. Even as guilt pressed against me, the stronger weight holding me still was fear. Fear that refused to let me walk away from smell of smoke and light a fire into what could be a trap buried in black trees. My arms trembled from holding steady more than from cold. The forest kept its hush. Each breath I let slip formed a cloud that hung fat in front of me before fading away slow, hanging longer than I remembered breath. Lasting. I sipped air harshly, like the oxygen itself threatened to betray me out loud. Every bit of the night sharpened into details that didn't matter, but I memorized anyway to distract myself. How my right boot had a crust of snow cracked across its top. How the flames orange bled into pale blue edges near the logs. How the skin of my knuckles had cracked into tiny red lines. All of that was easier than letting the echo of that voice stampede in again. A long while passed with me frozen by the fire, each second louder in my body because they built on each other. The scream didn't repeat. It didn't carry a second wave. And with that, a part of my head told me maybe I had been wrong in the first place. Maybe loneliness in the woods amplified to the point of tricking me. It was easier to picture a mind's slipped in a person crushed under some weight out there. But no matter how I tried dressing it, I knew the tone too well in my bones. It had been human. That's when the sharp guilt pressed deeper. Human, but I did nothing. The logic spoke up, again, calling itself. If predators were involved, if that was staged, then me surviving meant not taking the bait. But the steadier side of me hated how quick survival stripped compassion away. I thought about my parents sitting warm at a table hours away, probably, saying things like, "He always does his own thing," not realizing, at that same moment, I was perched by a fire, listening to maybe another person beg for life, and choosing not to move toward it. I reached for the fire, pushing a log that had slid too far toward the edge. Sparks popped. I flinched. My hand shook so badly that I almost tipped the log out, instead of deeper into the flame. That was my grounding motion though, my admission of choice. I decided against whatever that scream really was and leaned into camp instead. My fire mattered more than the shadows, even if it kept me awake in guilt later. When I pulled my hood tighter and hunched near the glow, the dark didn't lean back to let me be. Instead, it pushed closer. Shadows pressed the outer ring of light with a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was in my head, maybe smoke made edges reach longer, but I could feel the space tightening, closing in, as if whatever lay out there knew I'd chosen the fire over the voice. It didn't help that the fire chose that exact moment to roar out with another batch of flames catching on a pocket of sap. The sudden hiss and spark shot upward, lighting my face brighter than I meant it to. I jerked back like the simple fire had betrayed me, like I'd been broadcast for anyone carrying a rifle to see. The orange reflection pulled against the snow around me, lighting up my boot tracks like fresh signals. I thought about stamping it out, but then realized that would mean getting closer to the open, exactly where I felt exposed. So I sat low, hugging myself small, waiting for the ringing in my ears to stop. Each burst of gunfire seemed to come in clusters instead of neat intervals. That's what gnawed at me, because if it were hunters, I'd expect a clean shot. Time for pacing, maybe another. This sounded more like chaos than practice or sport. Bam, 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 pause, another string. It almost felt like whoever it was didn't know how much noise traveled in these woods. Or maybe they knew and didn't care. Both ideas sat heavy. The smell hit me again, faint but sharp, making my nose sting. Maybe it really was gunpowder, or maybe smoke from my fire turned acrid in low air. The fact remained I couldn't split them apart. My body acted like they were real though, tightening as if something dangerous had crossed into my camp already. I knew panic sells lies to the mind. That's one of the ways fear grows. But my chest didn't believe facts at that point. I told myself plain and simple truths to stay steady. You're alone. You haven't seen anyone else out here. Sound carries far. People do odd things in the woods, and it doesn't always mean it's linked to you. Repeat. Repeat again. Those sentences became small anchors in the rush of thoughts. But the image that came each time was someone turning, seeing the orange glow of fire flicker between the trees, and raising a barrel because it was easier to aim at light than shadow. That picture wouldn't leave Dot, so I stayed put, balanced between, trying not to breathe loud, and trying to convince myself not every stranger in the forest was reason to fear. I sat until the sharp noises dulled into distance again. My heart slowed enough for me to notice the fire's warmth on my boots. I steadied myself. I whispered in my head that not every sound meant danger. It helped a little, enough to move. One hand back toward my bag for comfort. And then it came, the sound that wasn't a shot, wasn't wind, wasn't fire. It scraped against the night in a way that wrenched everything quiet inside me. This time it wasn't something metallic striking through trees. It wasn't an echo bouncing wrong on frost. It was a voice, not words, not yet, but the raw edge of something human. And that was worse than every shot that had come before. Asterisk, asterisk. While the fire started consuming its first thin branches, I unrolled my bag and set it in the tent. The nylon material loudly crackled against the stillness. My ears kept straining, and I hated how loud small noises felt. The half-empty plastic wrapper from my trail food seemed like an alarm with how sharp it crinkled. Smoke clung quick to my jacket, sinking into the fabric, and I caught myself rubbing my sleeve a few times because it carried through even when I pulled away from the fire. The heat barely touched my hands before it left them cold again. I found myself pulling closer and closer until I felt the hair on my knees prickle from the heat. When I leaned back, the dark was right there pressing in again. For a few minutes I forced myself into the rhythm of camp. I boiled a little snow on the stove and added a packet of instant soup. The steam was thin, but it gave off enough heat for me to clutch the cup like it was more important than it really was. My eyes kept darting outside the fire zone, as though I'd catch someone standing there if I looked at the right time. Every so often I thought I saw the shape of a figure blend with tree bark, but whenever I blinked or glanced back, it was only a trunk. I chewed slow, strip by strip, convincing myself to stop overthinking, but the feeling stuck like static. I noticed it most when I leaned over my backpack to dig for food. My shoulders tightened. Sure, something was watching the back of my neck, carrying out a normal chore, like tearing open a snack, felt exposed. It made me rush despite trying not to show panic to myself. I told myself it was natural to feel that way being alone, that the mind plays tricks when the dark builds around you, but part of me didn't believe it. Every time I adjusted my pack or sorted items, I wanted to whip around faster than my body would let me. The strangest moment came when I paused with food in hand and the wind shifted. It wasn't strong, just a soft brush through branches, but the air pulled against me in a way that carried a noise I didn't recognize. I thought for half a second it carried voices tucked inside the gust, too faint to make out, like words said behind a wall. I shook my head, blinked, told myself it was the way wind split through the trees and made eerie patterns, but my ears kept reaching for it. Then came another crunch in the snow. Unlike before, it didn't line with my movements. Since I was sitting still, the fire hissed louder the longer I listened. The crunch never returned, but the silence where it had been seemed more pointed after. I found myself checking shadows repeatedly. My eyes adjusted to the fire, so the edges beyond. It seemed darker every time I stared. At one point, I swore a long shadow slipped forward, stretching closer to me than before. But when I forced myself to focus, I saw it was only a low trunk angled across the snow. I kept scolding myself for the paranoia, repeating in my head that it was just nerves. But talking myself back never fully worked. I knew the mind can do small distortions, especially tired and alone, but the body doesn't follow reason. Goosebumps crawled up my arms regardless. The fire burned uneven now, popping with more smoke than before. Every now and then sparks jumped out, tiny lines vanishing almost instantly in the cold air. I rubbed my hands together, stared into the flame, and tried to hold on to the one rhythm I could see, but in the moments between crackles, the quiet stretched again and left my spine too aware of itself. I don't know if I imagined footsteps joining mine earlier, or if they were real, but the possibility lingered sharper now. It made the trees seem less like scenery and more like tall shapes waiting around. I set my cup down, forced my breath slow, and told myself to stop. That leaning in on fear would only make me believe things weren't there. Even after trying to be rational, the unease still held on. I checked the tree line more than the fire, nervous my eyes would catch a break in the pattern of dark lines. Nothing moved but the air from time to time. I knew it should be comforting that there was no proof of anyone near me, but that feeling never turned into calm. It was while I stared at the fire, pretending I was finally settling in, that the first sound broke, the fragile calm. The forest is quiet, until it isn't. 1 second I was crouched beside the fire, poking weak logs forward, and letting sparks slip off into the cold air, and the next a sharp crack tore across the trees. It was muffled, but still distinct, a punch of sound that didn't match the usual groans of branches or the hiss of settling ice. I froze halfway between picking up another stick. My fingers cramped against the wood as I tried to process it. A second later, another crack. This one followed fast, like an echo, but the rhythm didn't fit an echo. It was too clean, too sudden. I knew right away it was closer to a gunshot than anything else. For a moment I sat perfectly still, shoulders bent, barely breathing, waiting to see if it repeated. The air didn't carry smoke from my fire anymore. Instead, there was only that wide open stillness pressing in. The cold night has a strange way of carrying sounds farther than they should go. It stretches them out so they ride along frozen air and reach you sharp, with no softening. That made it worse, because I couldn't judge the distance. The shot could have been miles away, or it could have been a few hundred yards. That uncertainty left me listening harder than I ever thought I could. Nervous, my heartbeat would drown it out. A third shot rang, shorter, clipped, like someone wasn't steady on the trigger. That's when my brain started building explanations, cycling through them too fast to believe any of them. Hunters, yeah, that made sense, even though it was Christmas Eve, and the light was already gone. But hunters didn't usually fire erratic bursts. Maybe fireworks, but no sparkle or trailing fizz, no afterlight, just a blunt rap of sound bouncing between tree trunks. Then the one explanation I didn't want to hold on to, someone else, out here, pulling a trigger for reasons that didn't involve sport. I adjusted on the log seat by the fire. Even that small movement loud in my ears. It felt like a mistake to move at all. If someone was closer, I didn't want light from my fire marking me as an easy target. I actually thought about crouching down to put it out, smothering the flame and melting into the dark, but the idea of standing up and showing my outline froze me harder. Instead, I tightened my arms against my knees and waited. The fire shifted, and one of the logs collapsed in on itself, but I barely looked. My eyes were fixed past it, the spaces separating trees now looking wide enough to hide shapes between them. The air had a sharpness to it now. One I thought smelled faintly metallic. I still don't know if it was real, or if my head built the scent to pair with the noise. Sometimes heavy smoke lingers on your jacket in cold enough weather, but for a breath or two I swore I smelled gunpowder sliding through the wind. I rubbed my sleeve against my scarf, trying to erase it. Meanwhile, another volley cracked out. Not a hunter's rhythm, no pause to aim, no distance between shots. These came frantic, uneven, like panic pushed the trigger instead of control. My body flinched with each one, even though my ears couldn't tell direction for sure. By then my soup cup had gone cold next to me, but my palms were damp with sweat despite the temperature. The noise made my muscles seize up, a steady warning inside my chest that said, don't move, don't make a sound, don't let them know you're here. Every sense felt overchanged, the way animals stiffen in the brush when they know a predator is near. I pressed my tongue against my teeth to make sure my breathing didn't whistle. Even those tiny things felt like mistakes I couldn't risk. Minutes stretched, but the echo still bounced. What I hated most was how the shots sounded like they arrived from one direction at first, and then shifted to the opposite side. Cold air does that, it twists sound and lifts it, sending it down across gullies and ridges you can't even see in the dark. It got impossible to pin down. Was it left? Was it right? Was it half a mile off the ridge, or just beyond the tree line? My brain kept spinning, refusing to settle. I stood at one point, half bent, about to step toward my tent, when the forest snapped again, and my legs buckled right back down. Christmas Eve should have been quiet, the kind of night, with nothing but crunching snow and the glow of porch lights, but, instead, I found myself frozen in the woods, listening to what sounded like a scream echo through the trees. Was I hearing things, or was someone actually out there? Every step I took away from my campsite made me feel like shadows were stepping closer. People always say the forest is peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hunting me. What I learned later still makes me question what I walked away from that night. The woods in winter can look calm in a way that tricks you. You take the first step onto a snow-covered path, and everything feels harmless, like the open air is washing away whatever's been weighing on you. That's what I told myself when I decided to spend Christmas away from everyone I knew. I wasn't running from something specific, it was more the constant weight of family expectations, work emails that never seemed to stop, and the pressure of pretending to be cheerful when I didn't feel like I had much in me to give. The idea of walking into the trees and letting the cold silence swallow all that noise sounded perfect. I thought it would be peaceful. I remember changing plans last minute. My parents expected me at dinner. My brother texted me that he saved me a seat at the table. Instead, I packed my backpack with layered clothes, a cheap sleeping bag, a small tent, and a simple stove. I told myself it wasn't about avoiding them, but it was. I wanted distance. I wanted no one to ask questions about why I seemed quieter this year, or what I was doing with my life. In the woods, nobody asks. Nobody looks at you. It's just space to breathe. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I parked my car near the frozen trailhead and watched the daylight fade faster than I was ready for. Snow muffles everything. It's obvious the second you step into it. The crunch of your own boots is sharp, but the moment it ends, the quiet seeps back in like nothing happened. I followed the trail near a frozen stretch of river, and the ice gave off soft pops, cracking sounds that seemed to come from beneath the surface. The trees bent under the weight of snow, their branches cracking and dripping from time to time. It should have been normal background noise, but for me, each sound hit sharper than usual, like my brain wanted to assign meaning to every snap. The cold here didn't just sting the skin, it set into the bones. My breath froze in front of me, in quick puffs, hanging in pale clouds before vanishing. My gloves weren't as thick as I thought they were, and the weight of the pack pressed the straps colder against my shoulders the longer I trudged along. The light slipped away earlier than expected to. I set out thinking I'd have hours of pale sun lighting the trail, but by the time I was a mile in, everything was cast in blue-gray shadows. The moon hadn't risen yet, and dark outlines of trees stretched tall across the snow. I tried to comfort myself by saying the stillness was exactly what I came for, but it didn't sit right. The strange part was how the branches stood bare, jagged with snow lining their edges. At a glance they looked like thin figures leaning, just where the dim light reached. Once or twice, the dark outlines almost resembled a person standing off the trail, and I caught myself staring until the shape resolved back into a tree. Still, the impression lingered. I pressed on, trying to keep moving, but the unease crawled behind the intent to stay calm. At one point, I stopped to adjust my pack straps, and the sound of footsteps echoed oddly along the trail. For a split second, I was convinced they weren't mine. When I paused, everything stilled. When I resumed, I swore I heard a faint crunch line up just a little off rhythm. It might have been echo, but echo in snow doesn't behave like that. Not the way it came half a beat late. I told myself it was ridiculous that my head wanted shapes where there weren't any, and footsteps where only mine existed. I'd been craving solitude so badly, and now that it was here, I was already second-guessing it. There's a sort of false comfort that comes with setting the rules of your own loneliness. I believed being out here would give me control after months of feeling pulled in too many directions. I wasn't surrounded by relatives asking me to smile in family pictures. I wasn't scrolling through coworkers' endless holiday posts. And I wasn't stuck in conversations I had no patience for. I was choosing the quiet. I thought choosing, it meant power. Like if I was alone on purpose, then nothing could disturb me. But that kind of control is thin. Every flicker of unease pushed against it, like paper getting wet and tearing apart too easily. With each step, Sound seemed to play tricks. A branch snapping would travel farther than expected, bouncing between trunks until it was impossible to guess where it came from. My own breath grew harsh in my ears, making me think something was moving behind me. The snow amplified everything but also blurred it at the same time. That combination felt wrong, like the forest didn't want me to know what was near me and what wasn't. At first, it made me laugh under my breath out of nerves. Then I realized how quickly that nervous laugh disappeared and left a heavier pressure in its place. I shifted the backpack once more and noticed my shoulders trembling, not just from cold, but from how tightly every sound gripped me. The silence didn't soothe me anymore. A woodpecker hammering in the distance startled me, even though I knew exactly what it was. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought came through that I hadn't expected. Solitude isn't peaceful when you notice how easily harmless sounds slip into threats. Every pop, every crunch, every falling patch of snow gets bigger inside your head than it really is. I had only been walking for maybe an hour, but it felt stretched thin, like time worked differently when there was no glow from windows, no buzz of cars, no signs of life except whatever might share the dark with you. I stopped again on the trail, listening hard. My ears strained so much that I caught a faint ringing under the silence. The snow around me gleamed pale, and I couldn't tell where the trail ended or where the trees began to crowd tighter. I think that's when I noticed how uncertain the forest actually felt. The snow made everything echo, but the echoes never gave me direction. I realized I couldn't tell if a sound came up from the frozen river or from just a few feet behind. It disoriented me in ways I didn't expect. Loneliness sharpened it, too. If I had someone else there, we could check each other, say, "Did you hear that?" Alone, I was stuck rewriting the noises until they felt larger, darker, full of menace, even if they were nothing. That's when I understood isolation doesn't quiet fears, it magnifies them. Saying I wanted space didn't mean I was ready to hear the forest push back at me. The trees looked taller, the air colder, the dark thicker, all because my thoughts doubled them. Fear sneaked in without rushing, just steady, like it waited for me to get past the first layer of calm. That realization made me walk quicker, the pack heavy but my pace edging faster without knowing why. And yet, through all that, I couldn't push away one simple idea that sat heavy in my stomach. The woods weren't as empty as they first looked. A camp should feel like the safest part of a trip, a base where everything centers around you. But the first thought I had after setting mine up was that it looked more like a stage than a shelter. The trees framed the clearing in tall, stiff lines. The snow reflected the dim glow of the fire I managed to build, and the circle of light felt thinner than it should have. I chose a spot beside a set of bent spruce trees with a patch of open ground between them. Their branches dipped low enough to feel like a guard, and for a minute I convinced myself it gave privacy. Still, when I looked at the set-up small tent, fire, backpack leaning with gear spilling out, it felt exposed, like I was presenting myself to something I couldn't see. I was clumsy with my hands while I worked. My fingers kept going numb and stiff, and I struggled just to pull open the knots in the cord I was using for the tent lines. My breath hung pale in front of me and scattered when I exhaled too fast. Trying to jam metal stakes into frozen ground made me sweat, even though the cold kept stinging my face. Everything took twice the effort. Once I finally forced the tent up, uneven but standing, I started on the fire. I'd planned ahead and brought matches wrapped inside a dry bag, but the wood around me was half frozen under snow. I had to break twigs apart with my boots. After a long stretch of fumbling, I caught a flame on small bark shavings and let it climb over the rest. The crackling instantly stood out against the muted quiet around me. Light should feel welcoming, but in the woods, it makes the space smaller. The glow warmed a shallow ring of snow and threw out lines of shadow into the trees. Beyond that circle, the dark stretched overly far. The snowfall kept drifting slower than I expected, just enough to dim every sound. The fire popped and hissed, with sap, but outside that rhythm there was nothing to bounce back. The woods didn't carry voices of owls or chipmunks running through snow. They were flat and blank. It felt like the dark was listening too closely.